Welcome to 5 Good Minutes.
You're listening to today's inspirational message on the book of Romans
with Dan Irvin.
Well, today I want to continue in Romans chapter 2, and I want to look at verses 21 through 24 today. Paul writes these words, "You then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that people should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? As it is written, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you." What does Paul mean in verse 24 there when he says God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you? Well, I think what Paul is getting at here is that there's a danger in promoting a certain way of living, but not living that way yourself. You know, a life of religious legalism, claiming to do all of the right things, and maybe in some ways, in a true sense, people like this that do live a good life, but they're a little bit smug about it. They're a little bit oversensitive about their goodness because it is their righteousness. They're a little bit judgmental because in some ways they find other people worse than them so that they can lift themselves up. And maybe they're just a little bit anxious, wondering, have I done enough? Well, what happens a lot of times is I think people that are outside of the church, outside of faith, look at this, people like this, and they dislike a God who would live like this or promote living like this. Paul's argument here is pretty simply, hey, you were called to be a light of the world. You think of yourselves as bringing a light into a dark place. And yet, people around you don't see that light. They see something completely unattractive, something that they don't want to be a part of. Don't you think there's a better way to live this out? Is essentially Paul's message here. I don't know if you've ever found yourself in this situation. Maybe you yourself can relate to this. Maybe you have even seen people like this that you've grown up around or seen in the church. It can be frustrating on both sides of it. But I think there's a reality is that when we look at the gospel, we look at the hope in which Jesus offers us. You see, Jesus is the only teacher who never failed in his own teaching, who said what he said, who practiced what he preached in a perfect sense. Jesus had every right to condemn us for our inconsistency. But instead of condemning us, he actually absorbed the condemnation that we deserved. He took it upon himself, the penalty that was due us. And when we understand this gift from God, this grace that God has given us, it really allows us to say, I know I'm not who I should be. I know I can't live up to God's perfect standard. And I don't need to hide. I don't need to pretend. I don't need to act like I've got it all figured out. Because when we can start living in that way and start living in a free way, free to make mistakes, free to talk about those mistakes with other people around us and bring things to light, it's an attractive living. There's so many times as a parent, especially, where I've had to go to one of my kids and apologize and say, hey, in this situation, I lost my temper. I said something I didn't want to say. I made a decision that I probably shouldn't have made because I made it in haste or whatever it was. And you know what I've seen, I think, over the years is that my kids have probably understood more about God's grace, about what God is doing in my own life in those moments than in any other moment of parenting where I say, hey, this is how we should live. I want you to live like this and not like this. Do this, don't do that. When grace is on display in our own life, it draws people in because God's beauty and God's grace is the thing that people are after, that will lead them to living in the way that God commands.
Thanks for joining us here today. There's a lot of great content to explore on Orchard Hill Plus and on the Orchard Hill main feed from the weekend. Have a great day.